Hi BookTube! We're in a very different setting than usual, and I'm actually standing up, so I might be moving a bit more because I have trouble staying still. Anyways, I'm here with my reading stats, my wrap up for the year. I read 112 books this year, which is 12 over my goal of 100, which is awesome. There were a few months where like it went down and a few months where it like skyrocketed, so that'll all be explained on my nice charts. I have my massive huge TV here that I couldn't get all in frame, but the pictures will be all in frame and hopefully you can see this here. So we're just going to start off with pages per month. So it has tracked how many pages I read per month, and it will be 10 times, I believe. No, I don't know. I believe this information is wrong. I should have looked at this before. I don't understand why this is labeled pages per month but only has things like 10, 9, 3, because I think that's the amount of books I read per month. So this might be mislabeled. So 10 books in January, my lowest was March with 3, my most was October with 17 books, that's amazing. 15 in August, like the last half of the year went really well, and then like before that, like March, April, May, not so good, especially March. I'm surprised there were only 3 books there. So ignore this, it's not pages per month, it's books per month, which means hopefully, there we go, pages per month. That makes more sense to see numbers in the thousands. I didn't read 3 pages in March, I read 3 books in March. And those 3 books equaled 836 pages. So the most pages I read was October with 3,544. I started off strong with 2,745, and in February I did even better. And then March, April, May went down. I think April was so long despite so few books because I was reading a Malazan book at that time. So I think the average is probably somewhere in the 2000s there, which is pretty cool. Here we have the type of book that I've read. So I kept track of just like whether it was a novel, nonfiction, a comic or a manga, novellas, short stories, plays, and a picture book. I read 1 picture book and I counted that. I normally don't, but I did this time. And that was enough. I can't remember the name of the authors off the top of my head, but it's about the famine in Ukraine called the Holodomor. So it was an important picture book. That's why I counted it. Can't remember the play. A lot of short stories this year. There were 8 short story collections. That's something I normally like steer away from, but like this year I was just like gravitating towards them a lot. I even ended off the year with short story collections, with hitting a straight lick with a crooked stick, which doesn't count in these stats because I kind of screwed up with my audiobook and counted the stats before I switched audiobooks, so it will count for next year. But anyways, short stories. And then I read 8 novellas. Novellas for me are things under, I think, 120 pages. That's how I kind of defined a novella. 39 novels, 30 nonfiction. Like, that's like quite sizable. I thought that was interesting how much nonfiction I read this year. And then 28 comics and mangas. Most of those were probably the what's it called now? Made in Abyss series, which is fantastic, by the way. There are 8 of those I read this year. Then I did breakdown by genre for fiction. Majority were fantasy, which surprised me. I usually tend towards more science fiction and more like, well, I call it contemporary and literary. I guess contemporary is not literary fiction, but I didn't know what other category to put it in. So it's contemporary. I read 4 of those, 9 literary fiction, 8 historical fiction, which surprised me that there were so many historical fictions on there. But when I looked at it, I was like, oh yeah, I guess that is historical fiction. A lot of crime, mystery, and thrillers. Those I think were actually mostly graphic novels, actually. A lot of fantasy, and then science fiction was 14, so I read like more than twice the amount of fantasy there. It's pretty interesting. I like the genre breakdowns. Then this is the nonfiction breakdowns. I'd call it topics instead of genres because it didn't make sense to call it genres. I don't know. 12 of those were memoirs. 5 of those were for the Hilary Weston Prize for Nonfiction in Canada. I believe, yeah, they were all considered memoirs. These numbers don't all add up because there were multiple topics in one book. So, for example, Two Trees Make a Forest would be in memoir and in science. So, there you go. So, 1 philosophy, 1 history, 1 sexuality, 4 on science, 8 on race, 1 on feminism, and 5 on religion. So this year was the year that I started doing 1 book by a Black author and 1 book by an Indigenous author. So, and 1 book about religion. So the race books and actually the sexuality book actually were by those authors. I don't think I read any white authors' opinions on race. So I thought that was interesting. One of the other science books that I included it there because anthropology is technically a science. It's not like your typical kind of, your hard science that you're thinking of, but I included it there too, and that was Gods of the Upper Air, which was also a really good book about, and that was more of like the history of anthropology than anthropology itself. But that's just giving you an idea of what I think of when I think of the different genre breakdowns. And that was about like the Margaret Mead group called the Boaz Circle. Yeah, I'll talk more about that in another video. Then the format I read books in. So I read 60 physical books, which was the majority of my reading. Ebooks and e-comics were 32. All my comics were e-comics. No, they weren't. That's a lie, sorry. So they would have been counted in physical as opposed to just as a comic, because I read Amulet last month, which would have been a physical copy. So, excuse that. Most of my comics are in e-comic form. Let's just reiterate that. And 19 audiobooks, which is good. I only thought I listened to like 1 a month, but apparently I did more than that. So that's pretty cool. Then we move on to the age breakdown, and you can definitely see I tend to favor adult centered books. I read 100 of those of my books were for adults. 8 were middle grade, which was interesting as well. I did a bit of a reread of books that I liked when I didn't go to middle school. Like, we just had like kindergarten to grade 8 and then like grade 9 to grade 12. So I don't know exactly what like middle grade is, but around that age, I guess. I reread a few of my favorites from there. I had 1 YA. Can't remember what it is now for the life of me, but I read 1. And I read 2 children's books. Yeah. Oh yeah, and 1 was a picture book and 1 was like a chapter book. Like, not a middle grade novel. It was like definitely meant for children, written at that level, but just had chapters and was a bit longer. Okay, and then dates published by decade, and this is something that really surprised me, because I tend to stay like 1990s and back, but I actually read 10 new releases this year. Granted, 5 of those were from the Weston Prize, but that's still like something that stands out to me. I generally don't read newly released fiction or nonfiction or books in general, because price mostly. So that was an interesting thing to see. And most of my books were from the 2010s, which was surprising too. Yeah, I guess I'm just gravitating more to like newer books. 20 from the 2000s, and then from there on, 9 in 1990s, 4 in 1980s, 4 from the 1970s, 3 from the 1960s, 2 from the 1950s, none in the 1900 to 1940s, and 3 from the 1800s. So I definitely didn't read a lot of classics. And I don't think I classify classics as classics. I do that as their own, like, whatever genre they are. So if it was like a science fiction classic, it would be in science fiction. Or if it was like, I'm trying to think of a classic I read this year. For example, if I read Pride and Prejudice, it would get classified as romance as opposed to a classic, if that makes sense. Okay, author gender breakdown. 76 men and 42 female authors. I'd like to make it more close to half. That's hard with my books being all wrapped and I can't really pick out female authors, but I'm trying to remedy that in 2021 with picking ebooks and audiobooks by female authors to try and level out this number a bit more. And then here is my breakdown for books by Black, Indigenous, and People of Color was 47, and 64 whites. I'm actually surprised that this came this high this year. I used to read mostly white authors, and I'm making a very concerted effort in 2021 to get this number higher as well. I think this came up because I started reading at least one book a month by a Black author or an Indigenous author. So that's pretty interesting there. I find that it is that much, but it could be more. So it's 42% compared to 57.7%. And the breakdown of the Black, Indigenous, and People of Color authors, most of them were Black with 17. And Black, I don't know if I should break it down further into Black Americans and African people, so let me know in the comments down below if I should probably do that. So Black were 17, Indigenous in North America, I clarified that. I know there's Indigenous populations in Australia and like arguably Indigenous people in different places that have experienced colonization that we don't normally think about, like places in Asia. But for this specifically, I want to talk about North American Indigenous people. So I read 12 books by them. I read one book by Pakistani person, one book by Persian author, 2 by Chinese, 2 by Indian people. Oh, see, I have Aboriginal over here for Australia. One book by an Australian Aboriginal, and 12 books by Japanese authors. Most of those were for, Made in Abyss. So, like, even if I read an author multiple times, I counted them each time I read a new book. Yeah. It's a very colorful wheel there. Okay, and then location by continent, and this is something else that I want to work on too, because most of my books are from North America. There's 50 there. And the next biggest one is fantasy, so that's kind of like where the book took place, and then space was 7. If it was kind of like all over the place on Earth, then I just classified it as Earth. So 1 from South America, 16 from Europe, 2 from Africa, 6 that took place in Asia, and 2 that took place in Oceania. So I think that's another neat thing to keep track of. So next year, again in 2021, I want to see these numbers rise. I want to read from somewhere other than North America and the UK. So the UK got grouped in with Europe, so that number might go down a bit, but we'll see next year. Okay, and then this is further breaking down, so taking the continents and showing you where I read those authors from. And I gotta try and zoom in here, maybe. No, it's gonna lock, okay. Stop wobbling, please. Okay, so this is the continent of Africa, in case you didn't recognize it. And I have pins here, one for Nigeria and one for Algeria. And now I'm remembering that was actually a comic I read too. And the one from Nigeria was Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. I remember that one. So this needs to be filled in a bit more, I think. I'm tending towards a lot of Nigerian authors, so I kind of want to move like all over as well. And then here we have Asia. So I read one book that took place in Palestine. These are where the books took place, not where the authors are from, just FYI. One that took place in Pakistan, India, Vietnam, Taiwan, and 2 that took place in Japan. And here we have Europe, so 2 in France, 5 from the UK, 1 from Norway, 1 from Germany, 2 from Poland, 1 down here in Greece, 1 from Ukraine, and 2 from Russia. And that is finally Brothers Karamazov. Finally finished that book. It took me like a year and a half to do my reread, but I did it. And then here we have the majority of where my reading took place, 27 in the United States and 23 in Canada. I like seeing Canada really high, but I still like to, because I am reading so much there and I have read so much Canadian literature, and that is something that I gravitate towards. I want to try and push myself to the other side of the map. And here we have Australia. One that took place in Australia. I don't know where in Australia, so ignore the breakdown. I don't know if it took place here or here. I should probably clarify that. And then one that took place in New Zealand. And here we go, South America. I actually had to zoom in on it, and it is Guyana, because it was, you can't really see it up here. So Guyana is where my one book in South America took place. And that's it for my stats. Yeah, that's really, I love these videos and looking at what people read and the breakdown, and like how it makes you be more conscious of goals for next year, like keeping track of all this information and looking at it all compiled into charts and stuff like that. Like, you know, it made me realize certain things that I want to work on. So yeah, let me know your most interesting stat of the year. I don't know what my most interesting stat would be. What's the most interesting stat? I think the most interesting one to me is how many books I read from the year 2020. That's astounding. Like, almost 1/10 of my reading took place from this year. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for watching.